it's Penny here, and today we're going to be wrapping up the books that I read in May. I did do a mid-May wrap-up, so I will link that up here and down below if you want to check that out. And I am going to run this wrap-up as a book battle, as I have been doing recently. So basically, I pair up the books and I have them battle against each other until we work our way up to the champion of the month. So in my mid-May wrap-up, I picked champion for the first half of the month, and that was Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. So whichever book comes out as the champion for the second half of the month will be going up against that to decide what is the champion for the whole month, which I'm sure is going to be a really difficult decision because I did read some really good books. Also, overall this month I read 22 books, 11 of those were in the second half of the month. Spread them out quite evenly. So let's get into round one. Our first battle is The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty up against Before the Devil Breaks You by Libba Bray. Now, I've seen The City of Brass listed as both YA fantasy and adult fantasy, and I think it's a bit on the border of them both, but personally I would put it more in YA fantasy just because it is a bit simpler and has that more YA writing style, which is impossible to actually express what that means, but that's how I felt about it. Also, the characters did feel quite young, and the themes of trying to find somewhere where you belong are themes that are generally dealt with more in YA. So, what is the story about? We follow this girl who has no idea what happened to her family, but she does have the ability to understand any language, and in fact she knows a language that nobody else knows. And as well, she has healing powers, but she uses those healing powers to con people. Then she accidentally ends up doing some real magic, and she ends up on the run with this djinn, and they end up going to this city of magical beings, most of which I believe are inspired by Arabian mythology. Then there is also another perspective introduced in this book, which is a prince from this city, and obviously eventually they end up meeting up. What really frustrated me about this story was the pacing. A lot of the world building was done through conversations between different characters and the main character being told how this magical world worked, and just because of how long it took to actually get into the interesting action at the end of the book, by the time we got there I wasn't really very engaged. I didn't care much about the different characters, kind of wasn't that interesting to me. Also, a lot of the story is very politics focused, with the politics of these magical beings in their city, but again, I don't really care about that kind of plot unless it's really interesting and twisty, but this wasn't really. Overall, I just ended up a little bit disappointed, and now I'm not sure whether I should actually continue that series or not. If you have read the series, tell me whether it gets better or not. Then we have Before the Devil Breaks You by Libba Bray. This is a YA paranormal fantasy where we have these different characters with supernatural abilities, and they're trying to solve this ghost-related murder mystery. So this is the third book in the Diviners trilogy, and I was a little bit disappointed in the first two books. I thought this third book was actually way better. It is still relatively slow-paced and there's not much happening, but we do start to learn about a government conspiracy, a little bit about the previous generation of the Diviners, and a little bit about the source of the Diviners' powers. And a lot of the characters are finally becoming interesting. Their relationships and conflicts that have been building up for the first two books are finally getting interesting. But I do just think this book is very unfocused. There's a lot going on, and so that's why none of the individual threads are really progressed very far, even though this is a massive book. What was interesting about the story, and also kind of depressing, is that even though this series is set in the 20s, the 1920s, a lot of the themes are still relevant today, and that is the themes of racism, also a pandemic where people blame people of certain races for it, and also sexual assault. So lots of bad stuff that we still have to deal with, and that is really frustrating. I will say I'm hoping that the Black Lives Matter movement that is happening at the moment will lead to more positive changes. There has been some positive changes already, and hopefully that will continue, and we can actually end up with a better world instead of being 100 years later and being like, are things really that much better? But they are. Still, I did think that this story did a really good job of investigating those themes. As far as the battle goes, it's actually quite hard for me to compare these books because I went into them with such different expectations. I went into The City of Brass expecting it to be amazing because I'd seen a lot of hype for it, and then I went into Before the Devil Breaks You not really expecting to like it at all. So I think I ended up rating Before the Devil Breaks You higher than The City of Brass, even though, like, objectively, maybe they're more similar than that. Still, in the end, I feel like the characters in Before the Devil Breaks You are much more interesting, and the plot was much more interesting, so I'm going to put Before the Devil Breaks You through to the next round. The next battle is between two shorter pieces of work. So we have The Sandman Volume 1 by Neil Gaiman and The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman Perkins. The Sandman is this comic series that is about this magical being, godlike being that has the power of dreams. Unfortunately, at the start of the series, he is trapped, and when he eventually escapes, he has to then try and reclaim his power. Now, I'm always a little bit iffy on Neil Gaiman, and unfortunately this fell more on the side of something I was a bit disappointed in. I didn't really like the art style for starters, but this is an older series, so trends in art do change, so it's probably not entirely fair to judge it on that. But still, I just felt like there was a lot of stuff included in the comics which didn't really seem to have much point. I did find the Sandman to be a really interesting character, and I am going to continue the series because I do want to see if he can do more with that character, but I didn't feel like we got enough of that character within this first volume. Still, as I said, I am hopeful for the rest of the series. Then, The Yellow Wallpaper. I believe this is a book that a lot of people read in like high school. It does push back on the way that women were being treated at the time that this was written, like 1892 it was written, so a long time ago, and at that time obviously women were a lot more oppressed than they are now, although still the world. Why have we not made it much better yet? We're working on it. So this is a story about a woman who seems to be suffering from postnatal depression, but at the time her doctor, husband, and brother just think that she's being a bit oversensitive. You know, that's how women are sometimes. So they basically isolate her in this one room. She doesn't really agree with this approach, but she doesn't have much of a choice, and during her time in the room she becomes more and more obsessed with this yellow wallpaper. The part with the yellow wallpaper was really creepy, but I did think it really personified the anger she was feeling about being stuck in the room. Also, I really liked the use of capitalization throughout the story and how that was used to further express her anger. So overall, I did really enjoy this. So if I had to put this up against The Sandman, The Yellow Wallpaper would definitely be the one that heads through to the next round. Then we have The Guest List by Lucy Foley up against Fragments of the Lost by Megan Miranda. So I read both of these books for Kayla's Literally Dead book club. The Guest List is a thriller about this wedding that is set out in this really remote island. And throughout the story, you're learning about all the secrets and traumas of the different guests. And you also know right from the very beginning that at the wedding, something is going horribly wrong. I really enjoyed it. I liked all of the characters, even the ones who were really screwed up. And I thought the story just did such an amazing job of weaving all the different plot threads together into a cohesive whole. I think it also had quite a lot to say about sexual assault and just like men being very abusive and using women for their own purposes. And also just, I guess, callous people who use anybody for their own purposes. I would say for this, maybe trigger warnings for violence against children, not school children type age, because the past of some of these characters relates to what happened to them at school, and it was not very nice. Then Fragments of the Lost is a YA thriller, so we've got this girl whose ex-boyfriend has died and she is going through his stuff, helping to clear his room out, and as she's going through it, she's finding all these different things that trigger different memories, and then she starts to find some things that hint that her ex-boyfriend had a secret. I did like the way that the story investigated grief, especially when you're in that situation where you're the ex-girlfriend and people don't really allow you the same position as if you were a current girlfriend, even though you might feel very similar grief. I did find it a lot of fun trying to guess what the secrets were and what it was going to add up to, but I would also say that a lot of it was just about their relationship and them getting to know each other, which wasn't that interesting. Their ex-partners, so I don't think their connection was that amazing. And just like, it's been a little while since I read this now, and I feel like I've forgotten quite a lot. So if I had to put one of these two through to the next round, it would definitely be The Guest List. Okay, so on to round 2. Our first battle is between Shadowblack by Sebastien de Castell and Before the Devil Breaks You by Libba Bray. Shadowblack is the second book in the Spellslinger series. In the first book, our main character, Cullen, is coming up to his mage exams, but his magic has started to go missing. So at the end of that book, he ends up having to kind of go his own way. And in this one, he finds some other people who are having the same problem as him, and then he's trying to help them. I thought that this was a lot of fun. I don't necessarily find these books to be anything revolutionary, but they're just fun and enjoyable. There is quite a lot of humor throughout them. So there's this squirrel cat who sometimes is a little bit cliche in his violence and crime tendencies, but I still find them quite funny. I do also really like the philosopher characters that are in this, and I thought that that was progressed quite well in this particular book. And it's that aspect of the story that I'm looking forward to learning more about in future books. So as far as deciding who would win the battle between these two books, I think that Before the Devil Breaks You is trying to do something on a much grander scale, but because of that, for me at least, it's not really achieving that. Whereas Shadowblack, I don't think it's really setting out to achieve anything more than it is, and so it did a really good job, and it was just a lot more fun to listen to than Before the Devil Breaks You, which I still felt like I was slogging through it at some points. So because of that, I would have to put Shadowblack through to the next round. Next we have the Slug Queen Chronicles by S.O. Thomas up against The Vampire's Assistant by Darren Shan. The Slug Queen Chronicles is a middle grade fantasy. We're following this girl who's able to see colors when she sees strong smells or strong tastes or people speaking strongly. And at the beginning of this book, she finds out that her mother also had this ability, but her mother discovered that this was because of fairy dust, and she got involved with the fairy world. So our main character then attempts to trap a tooth fairy, and unfortunately that leads to her brother being kidnapped, because the tooth fairies have decided that they're not going to bother with just stealing teeth anymore. They're going to steal the whole child instead. So she goes to fairyland to try and save her brother. I thought that the world that has been created for the story was really interesting. It has quite a unique take on Santas and the tooth fairies, and there's flying cats. So that was really cool, but unfortunately I just didn't think that it was well enough explained, especially since it was so unique. You need a little bit more explanation to understand it, and also, like, I was confused. So that's a sign to me that a middle grade person would be more confused, although not necessarily, because sometimes middle grade people don't have the same assumptions going in that us older people do, so who knows. But I was definitely confused in some points. I also just thought the plot was a little bit overly convoluted, and that if it had been simplified a bit, it could have been a much stronger story. I will say though that I also really enjoyed the cute pictures that were included throughout the book. And I appreciated the neurodivergent representation in that our main character is someone who doesn't really like to be touched and doesn't always understand emotions in other people. And it seemed to be fairly well represented. Then we have The Vampire's Assistant by Darren Shan. This was so short. I listened to the audiobook of this and I felt like I'd barely started it and then it was finished. But it was still also a lot of fun. These are ones where I've seen them listed as middle grade and also listed as YA, and the beginning definitely felt very middle grade and that it was very simply written. I should say that this is the second book in the Cirque du Freak series, so in this one our main character is a vampire's assistant, and he's just spending some time with the freak show until some things go wrong. So at the end, the things that go wrong were quite dark, and that's the part that I wasn't entirely sure that it fit the middle grade demographic. But at the same time, I like really dark things, so I quite enjoyed the ending. So picking one of these to go through to the next round, I would definitely go with The Vampire's Assistant. Then we have The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch up against The Yellow Wallpaper. I need my notes to talk about The Lies of Locke Lamora. The Lies of Locke Lamora is a really popular adult fantasy, so I went in with a lot of expectations, which is always dangerous, and so I want to preface this by saying that I did really enjoy it, and I am looking forward to continuing the series. However, I did find there were some problems. Firstly, the story jumps back and forth in time, and while at first I found that quite clever, over time it got a little bit tedious and I felt like it really restricted the flow of the story, and it just felt like the book was trying to be too smart rather than just telling me the story. Then when it came to the characters, so the main character in the story is Locke Lamora, and he is a thief. He has this little band of thieves and they're doing bigger and bigger cons as they learn to be better thieves, and they end up stealing like excessive amounts of money from the nobles of the city. But why are they doing this? Who knows? They've got huge amounts of cash just stuck in their vault. No plans for how to use them. At the same time, they don't really seem to have anything particularly against the nobles. They just have no vision at all, which, considering that Locke is supposed to be this really smart guy, it just didn't make sense to me that he wouldn't have some kind of vision to take this band of thieves that are supposedly like his family. Why would he not be trying to get them into a better situation, or do something with all that money? Something, surely. And because he had no vision, then later in the story when he does something sort of heroic, it just felt kind of out of character for him, because all the stupid heist stuff he'd been doing earlier didn't really seem, I don't know, it just felt a little bit forced. And it seemed like the only reason he was really doing these heists was to prove that he was smarter than other people. And I'm just not really a fan of people that think they're better because they're smarter. Still, I do think there's a lot of potential in this world. There was some magic introduced, not much, just a touch, but what there was really interesting. Also, throughout the story, we get mentions of the love of Locke's life, but we never get to meet her. But I've heard we do in future books, so I will definitely be continuing the series, but so far not exactly a favorite. Still, if I'm putting it up against the yellow wallpaper, it's not really fair to compare like a 500-page fantasy against like a 10-page, 20-page, I don't know. The yellow wallpaper was very short, so a big fantasy against a small little short story, the big fantasy wins. So I'll put The Lies of Locke Lamora through to the next round. Then we have Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng up against The Guest List. Little Fires Everywhere was the group book for the Asian Readathon, and in the first half of the month I read Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, which I really loved, and so again I went into Little Fires Everywhere with fairly high expectations. So this story starts with this family home on fire, and all the kids are saying that it was done by the youngest kid in the family, and that is kind of typical behavior for her. So throughout the whole story, I'm waiting to really understand why she lit the house on fire, and I'm expecting it to have a pretty good explanation. But in the end, I was really disappointed. I didn't really think it was justified at all, and I'd really worry that some people would read this book and think that lighting your family home on fire is a good idea. Terrible. So what I did think that this book did really well is it looked into the themes of motherhood and adoption and abortion, and it investigated that from lots of different perspectives, and I thought that was a really good way to look at some of these stories. Unfortunately, by the end of the book, I didn't feel like any of the plot threads were satisfactorily resolved, so it was fairly unsatisfactory from that point of view. Also, throughout the book, we focus on a lot of the backstories of different characters, and a lot of those backstories were just kind of boring. There's also a lot of focus on the children from this family, and they're just rich and privileged, and again, not that interesting. There was definitely a part at the end of the story which is kind of about really knowing someone, and that bit did make me cry. So there's definitely a lot of merit to Little Fires Everywhere, but just in the end, I felt really unsatisfied. So it won't be a surprise when I put The Guest List through to the next round. Okay, so now we're up to the semi-finals. So firstly, we've got Shadowblack by Sebastien de Castell up against The Vampire's Assistant by Darren Shan. Both of these were just a lot of fun, but as I said, The Vampire's Assistant was just so short that I think I would have to put Shadowblack through to the next round just because there was a lot more to it. But I did enjoy both of them. Then we have The Lies of Locke Lamora up against The Guest List, and this is one of these ones that's actually really hard because they were both really good. But I did have a lot more criticisms for The Lies of Locke Lamora. So I think, even though I tend to like fantasy better, I think I'm going to put The Guest List through to the finals. because I just had a much better reading experience. It flowed so much better than The Lies of Locke Lamora, and even though the characters were really flawed, they felt so much more realistic. And maybe it's not fair to expect a fantasy to be realistic, but I do still expect my fantasy characters to feel like real people. So here we are at the finals. And the way that I kind of arranged this tournament was mostly like YA and middle grade on one side and adult on the other side. So I feel like the finals aren't necessarily very fair, because we've got Shadowblack by Sebastien de Castell up against The Guest List by Lucy Foley. Which one am I going to choose? I'm sure that it's not a surprise. I'm going to choose The Guest List. I just loved it so much. And I don't often like thrillers, but this is definitely one that's going to go on the list of some of my most favorite thrillers. But now we get to the decision that's actually going to be really hard. And that is putting up the champion for the end of the month up against the champion for the first half of the month. So we've got The Guest List up against Fool's Errand. I really liked both of these books. If you haven't watched my wrap-up from the first half of the month, Fool's Errand is an epic fantasy that's part of Robin Hobb's realm of the Elderlings. It deals with different kinds of telepathy, so telepathy with humans and telepathy with animals. It also has really strong themes of prejudice and overcoming that. I think that even though I really love The Guest List, I am definitely a fantasy reader first, so I would have to say that I love Fool's Errand even more than I love The Guest List. But I love them both. I really love them both. So that's all the books that I read in May. Definitely a much better reading month than June is turning out to be, but we'll see. We're only just at the beginning of June. As always, do let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about today, because I would love to talk with you more about them down in the comments. Otherwise, I hope that you're keeping safe and doing well, and I will see you next time.